Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding the Impact of COVID-19 on Nonprofits. For those of you who are returning Candid webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are here for the first time, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Zavada, and I'm a program manager for Candid based in our New York Learning Center. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Elizabeth Madge-Lessie, based in DC. Together, we'll be supporting today's webinar behind the scenes. So feel free to ask any questions that you have, and we'll be supporting you as best as we can. For a combined 90 years, Foundation Center and GuideStar helped change the world by giving people the information they needed to do good. In February 2019, the two organizations joined forces to become Candid. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. The greatest service we can provide is to be upfront about all that we know, and we envision a social sector capable of tackling the critical challenges and opportunities of our time. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources that they need to do it. We also wanted to pause and take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for being part of Candid's learning community. We know that these are challenging times for many of you, and the fact that you've taken time out of your day to join us today is something we definitely want to acknowledge and be grateful for. Do know that we have transitioned many of our trainings to a virtual format, and we've been providing resources on COVID-19 and the racial equity movements that have been taking place across the sector. And I'll be sharing the links for these in the chat in just a moment. And just in case you missed it, GrantSpace is now Candid Learning. And Candid Learning is your all-in-one destination for all of Candid's live and on-demand trainings, webinars, and other resources designed to improve your fundraising, sustainability, grant making, and transparency. And you can keep up to date with all of these learning resources by subscribing to our newsletter. Before I hand things over to our panel today, I wanted to do a quick poll just so we can get a sense of who is in the room with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll in just a moment. And we can certainly work with approximations here today, but in order for our panelists to be able to get a better sense of what types of organizations are in the room, it'd be really helpful to know what your approximate annual revenue is. Your options here are less than 25,000, somewhere between 25,000 and 500,000, between 500,000 and 1 million, or perhaps you're somewhere between 1 million and 5 million. And if you're over 5 million, do let us know that option through our chat here. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And it looks like 27% of the audience is less than 25,000 annual revenue. 7% are between 250,000 and 500,000. It looks like we have 21% reporting that they are between 500,000 and 1 million, and 45% are between that 1 million and 5 million mark. I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the chat here. And we do have a couple folks reporting that they are over that 5 million mark, and it looks like there's probably about 6 or 7 folks reporting that here in our chat. And we have over 400 participants here with us today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hide these results so we can get to our panel discussion. All right, Serena, the floor is yours. I'm really excited to introduce everyone to my colleague here, Serena Dayal. She's been working with our Insights team and really digging into the impacts of COVID on nonprofits and the social sector as a whole. Serena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here. My name is Serena, and I'm a research associate at Candid. And today we're going to try to help you better understand the impact of COVID-19 on nonprofits in the US and around the world through data. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague Jacob Harold, Executive Vice President of Candid, as well as Naomi Orenstein, Director of Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and Samira Mehra, Head of Global Alliance and International Networks at Charities Aid Foundation. Their bios can be found on the sign-up page for today's webinar. So we'll get started by setting some context for our discussion, first through an overview of survey responses from the sector globally, and a summary of what financial data tells us about the possible financial futures of nonprofits in the US. Then we'll get into a deeper dive with two organizations who've conducted their own research on the impacts of COVID-19 and discuss what their findings tell us about some of the opportunities and lessons learned for us all as we navigate the ongoing crisis. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. Perfect. All right. So in order to understand the impact and response to COVID-19, we noticed that there were a lot of surveys issued by a number of organizations. So we at Candid decided to undertake a survey of surveys, if you will, to aggregate these surveys and understand the needs, actions by, and types of questions shared across the field. I'll go through a brief overview of the findings, but there is a blog on Candid that's at blog.candid.org with full findings from our survey analysis. It can also be found on the coronavirus landing page shared earlier. Some brief background that's here is that we aggregated 51 surveys from 47 organizations of various type, including member-based organizations and community foundations. Just over half focused on the US, with the rest focusing on countries and locales outside the US and globally. A majority focused on nonprofits, and most surveys included in our analysis were conducted during peak months of the pandemic, at a moment of increased uncertainty about both immediate and long-term impacts. Both CAF's and CEP surveys, which are going to be discussed on this webinar, were included in our set. And we are also continuing to aggregate surveys, so we welcome you to share anything you see or you put out yourself with us. Next slide. Elizabeth, could you, there it goes, okay. To summarize what we've found, I'll present our findings in 4 categories. First off, and unsurprisingly, financial constraints are top of mind. Organizations without significant cash reserves are worried about limited savings at a moment when in-person fundraising and revenue-generating program services have been reduced or halted altogether. Adding to this concern, many anticipate a reduction in philanthropic giving as a result of economic disruption or redirected funding. However, there is also reliability on the philanthropic sector right now, which is actually something that Naomi will touch on a bit later. In the interest of time, I've also just included the highlights here, but you can see direct stats and examples themselves in the blog. Second, on top of financial constraints, there are a number of other challenges organizations are dealing with, such as operating remotely with limited technological capacity and capacity limited of staff and volunteers. I should note that these challenges were for the most part the same across different regions and for different organization types. Next slide, please. Might be a little lag on the slide changes there, but organizations are finding new ways to help their communities as well. They're shifting services to accommodate community needs and remote conditions, implementing cost-saving measures, and generally some have also shared a sense of hope that positive change can be forged through the adaptations the crisis has forced. Finally, and fourth, is the finding that organizations are building resilience and continued funder support is needed to continue that work. We know funders are being asked to provide sustained and flexible support for both the immediate short-term needs and long-term needs for both COVID-related and non-COVID-related programming. Foundations have been stepping up in a number of ways, increasing flexibility around application and reporting requirements, pooling their resources, and many findings have found that private foundations plan to increase grant making, both in response to COVID-19 and more recently in response to the rising racial and social justice concerns. But there also remains a lot of uncertainty over the long term, and it remains to be seen what practices that are in place now will end up sticking. So next slide. And before we dive deeper into the findings from CAF and CEP, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Jacob Harold to meet some of this general uncertainty with a high-level projection-based analysis of the financial landscape for US-based foundations. I'll give it to you, Jacob.
Thank you, Serena, and thank you to the 500 plus folks who have joined us today. And here's to hoping that the data that we share helps you and your organizations as you try to navigate this moment. I think we all can remember what it was like at the end of March, early April, as it really dawned on our society just how unique this moment was going to be. Next slide, please. And we all found ourselves trying to think about, how are we going to navigate this? And so at Candid, there were three pieces of analysis that we did that we think build on each other. And I'm noticing the chainsaw in the background, which just feels like such a perfect symbol of the way we all are navigating, this unique moment. But three pieces of analysis. The first one looked backwards and it said, let's look at the last 2 decades of the nonprofit sector within the United States and see what we can understand in terms of broader trajectories over time. The second piece of analysis looked at the nonprofit sector, again, in the US context, right at the moment when the crisis began, basically the beginning of 2020, and tried to understand what was the landscape of financial health across the sector before we got into this moment. And then thirdly, we looked forward. We're not able to predict the future, but we did run a series of scenarios to get a sense of the range of possibilities. Next slide, please. So what I'll be doing is sharing a couple highlights from each of these three pieces of analysis. I'll keep it relatively brief so that we can leave some time for discussion. The first finding is actually somewhat of a positive story. If you look back on the last 2 decades of the nonprofit sector within the US, and here we are just looking at 501c3 nonprofits. This does not include 501c4, C5, C6s, et cetera. And we also have excluded grant-making foundations. But you do see here an extraordinary growth in the collective business model of the nonprofit sector. Of the hundreds of thousands of organizations that have 501c3 status here in the US, and we've seen growth up to well over $1 trillion a year in both revenue and expenses. And what may be the most relevant finding is to look at 3 years where there was economic dislocation during this 20-year period, during the first .com crash and the Great Recession. And that even in those moments, there still were, as a field, we still saw net positive revenue, which is to say that in aggregate, the nonprofit sector has not had a loss in the last 20 years. It seems likely that we will see a different story in 2020, although we still don't know. But this did, I think, highlight that the economic story for the nonprofit sector over the last 2 decades has been, in total, relatively positive. Next slide, please. However, that collective or aggregate story where you add everyone up, it obscures some pretty profound inequality. And in particular, we noted extraordinary inequality in net assets held by nonprofit organizations in the US. And of the 315,000 that we looked at, just 500 of those organizations held half of the total net assets. An extraordinary degree of wealth inequality within the nonprofit sector, which of course, has different causes and different consequences than wealth inequality among individuals. But it is an important part of the story of understanding the economics of the overall nonprofit sector. Next slide, please. As we then started to look at the distribution of financial fragility across the nonprofit community, one key metric is number of months of cash. So this is if your revenues went to 0 and your expenses stayed the same, how long could you last before you ran out of money? And this also is a mixed story. And we do see that about half of nonprofits have 6 months or fewer of cash. But often that's entirely appropriate. If a nonprofit has a stable business model, that may be plenty for them to maintain their operations. But it was a reminder that facing a significant dislocation, as we have, that you have hundreds of thousands of organizations that don't have enough in the bank to withstand something that's longer than a few months. Next slide, please. So we then wanted to look forward and understand, given this distribution of relative financial strength, what might happen. And there's no way for us to predict the future. We don't yet know exactly how this will affect nonprofit revenues or expenses. We don't know how that impact will be different for those nonprofits that rely on service revenue versus contributions. And perhaps most importantly, we don't know how long this crisis will last. So what we did is we put together 20 different scenarios that offer different guesses as to what might happen. And you can see the specific numbers behind those scenarios right here. How long does the crisis last and what is the impact on revenue and expenses? Next slide, please. So we then took these 20 scenarios and applied them to the specific finances of the same set of 315,000 nonprofits, and figured out, well, how many would actually go out of business given the particular variables in a given scenario. And we found an extraordinary range, as expected, that there are some scenarios where we might actually see a significant increase in revenue and at the same time a lot of cost savings. Those feel pretty unlikely right now. There are scenarios where this crisis lasts a long time and scenarios where it's relatively brief. But this does give us an understanding of, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the median scenario was that 22,000 additional nonprofits go out of business than would have in the absence of this crisis. And on the one hand, given the severity of the crisis, out of 315,000 nonprofits in our analysis set, that's arguably encouraging that it's less than 10%. But it's easy to say that in the abstract. It is not so easy if you are someone who's served by one of those nonprofits or someone who works at one of those nonprofits. And so we have a danger here of the abstraction hiding real stories on the ground of real suffering. So it's a double story. It's a story of the overall strength of the nonprofit sector, even in the face of this crisis, and the very real suffering that we see on the ground. And given the range of different outcomes that we see across these scenarios, we need to prepare for the possibility that we see a much worse outcome. And there are specific things that nonprofits and funders and the government can do to help us avoid those scenarios. Next slide, please. And another thing, I won't spend too much time here, but is just an acknowledgement that we saw very different outcomes across different issue areas, just as we saw different levels of financial security across different issue areas. And this to us was a reminder of the extraordinary diversity of the nonprofit sector, and the diversity not just of issue areas, but of business models, and that different types of business models are more or less vulnerable to the kind of economic dislocation that we're seeing in 2020. Next slide, please. And as a final thought, I want to share something not from Candid's analysis, but from analysis from our colleagues at the Center for Civil Society Studies at Johns Hopkins University, which gets to the human side of this crisis. And that by their analysis, based on data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there have been about 1 million job losses in the nonprofit sector this year. Now, some of those have come back, but 1 million people at some point who work in nonprofits have lost their jobs at some point in the last few months. And it's worth noting that in particular, the arts sector has been hit really hard. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, although it's also a reminder of the extraordinary creativity that the arts sector has shown in response to this crisis, whether it's new kinds of socially distant performance or online fundraising, whatever it may be. So I end on this to highlight the human costs of this moment. And with that, I'll hand it back to Serena.
Thank you, Jacob, for sharing those points. It's really great to see the potential for resilience in the sector and also the very real potential for worse outcomes. And it's definitely fascinating to factor in different components such as the wealth inequality, differences among business model and organization focus. With that, I think this context will be especially interesting to consider as I turn it over to Naomi with the Center for Effective Philanthropy. CEP uses data and insights to enable philanthropic funders to better assess and improve their effectiveness. In May, they conducted a survey of nonprofit leaders. Naomi, can you please share with us your key findings and questions from this research?
Thank you, Serena. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm eager to share a few of the high-level findings from our mid-May study in which we explored the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on nonprofits and also explored how foundations are responding and what nonprofits need from their funders. So as a national nonprofit, one of the ways that we work towards our mission of greater philanthropic effectiveness is through creating rigorous research and elevating the nonprofit perspective. And so I'm going to, in the interest of time, pretty briefly run through the key findings here. I just do want to note that the full report, the methodology, and a broader slide deck of findings are all available on our website for free. One note also on methodology here. So the data here that I'm sharing is from a national sample of nonprofit leaders, and respondents are representative of the sector by size and geography. And I say that to emphasize that the data represents the experience of U.S. nonprofits from early summer. So let's dig in. Next slide, please. The first and main finding that I want to share, if there's really one thing that you take away from this part of the webinar, it's that while of course the pandemic has had devastating impacts on nonprofits, the negative impacts have been magnified for nonprofits that are direct service providers and nonprofits that serve historically disadvantaged communities. So moving to the next slide, on the whole, respondents to our survey told us that the pandemic is having a moderate or significant negative impact on their organization. They describe financial challenges, and they also describe, as Jacob alluded to earlier, difficulty supporting staff well-being, and also the difficulty of making decisions amidst so much change and uncertainty. But of course, nonprofits are differentially impacted based on who they are and what they do. So particularly looking at differences between direct service nonprofits and those who are not direct service nonprofits, as you can see here in the slide, 54% of direct service nonprofits rate the negative impact as significant compared to a much smaller proportion, 29% of non-direct service nonprofits. And moving to the next slide, nonprofits, of course, are responding to these compounded crises in various ways. Almost all have canceled or postponed fundraising events. Most are reducing programs and services, drawing from reserves, reducing staff hours, wages, or employee benefits. Fewer, about half, have or will lay off or furlough employees, and a smaller proportion, however, will take out a line of credit. Moving to the next slide, at the same time, over half of nonprofit leaders are telling us that they're experiencing an increase in demand for their programs and services. So in other words, they're being asked to do more with less. In the survey, we asked nonprofit leaders the broad question: are you primarily serving historically disadvantaged communities and populations? And so those that do, here, as you can see in the slide, in the top bar in dark orange, you can see that 61% of nonprofits that primarily serve historically disadvantaged communities have experienced an increase in demand, a much greater proportion than the 35% of nonprofits that aren't serving these communities. Next slide, please. Nonprofit leaders are, of course, listening to the people and the communities that they serve. And the biggest challenges that they're hearing from their constituents are about financial insecurity, food insecurity, and mental health challenges. And as you can see here, looking at some of the quotes on the slide, they're describing the impacts of job loss, of housing insecurity, of hunger, and of broad well-being, including mental health. I want to turn now to the second finding about the revenue side. And so during this time, we see that nonprofits that rely on foundation funding are experiencing fewer negative impacts and more stable funding than those relying more on earned revenue or gifts from individual donors. So on the next slide, when we look at changes in revenue as a result of the pandemic, revenue from foundation grants is more stable than revenue from other sources. So again, here, taking a look at the darker orange bars, you can see that about 30% of nonprofits have seen a decrease in revenue from foundations. More, though, are seeing a decrease in revenue from major donors. Over half are seeing a decrease in revenue from individual donors, and almost 80% are seeing a decrease in earned revenue. Moving to the next slide, of course, nonprofits' major sources of funding really matters when it comes to the impact of the pandemic. Organizations that are primarily funded by foundations have been less negatively impacted by the pandemic than those who are more reliant on other sources of funding. So for example, here on the slide, again, in the orange bar, 26% of nonprofits that are largely funded by foundations rate the negative impact as significant, compared to a much greater proportion, 52% of other nonprofits. On the next slide, you can see that we can take a look at the actions that foundation funders have taken. And on the whole, respondents tell us that their foundation funders and major donors have been somewhat or very helpful to their organizations during the pandemic. We are seeing broadly that many foundations are being more flexible and loosening restrictions. So here on the slide, it's quite a list. I'll just highlight here that most nonprofit leaders are telling us that funders are allowing grant goals to shift, extending or waiving deadlines, and converting restricted grants into unrestricted grants. And, you know, when we get into Q&A, I really want to come back to this important topic, particularly the topic of providing, you know, long-term flexible funding and issues of sustainability. And I've got some data to give us to offer a sneak peek. And I want to turn now to my last slide. This, you know, none of this is a particular surprise, but I'd be remiss to not share what nonprofit leaders tell us that they most need from their funders right now. One is communication, especially greater transparency and information about future funding. And relatedly, they're asking for supports beyond the grant, particularly fundraising assistance. One nonprofit leader says, you know, tell your friends why you love us. They're also, you know, underscoring the importance of unrestricted funding and the need for more funding. They urge funders to give with a mindset of plenty and ask that foundations stop protecting endowments for the future. As one says here on the slide, as you can see, the future isn't going to matter for so many if they don't get the support that they need now. So here too, I've got a lot more to say about this, including some more sneak peek data points to share, but I'm going to stop here and turn it back over to you, Serena.
Awesome. Thank you, Naomi. I'm really glad we're able to have this conversation, and especially thank you for the point on equity here and the significant impact. It's great to see in figures, not obviously great to see, but that the historical impact to marginalized communities is pretty, you know, significant to see. And I agree that your findings about the dependency or lack thereof on foundation funding and flexible funder practices will be really great to get into at the end. So now I think we'll bring in Samira to zoom us out a little bit and talk about the global context and insights for COVID-19. Charities Aid Foundation has embarked on a number of polling studies to get a sense of the impact on the crisis over time and how organizations across the globe are adapting. So with that, I'll turn it over to Samira.
Thanks, Serena, and hello, everyone. So as Serena mentioned, we at CAF, just to give you a bit of context, we believe in a very strong, independent and diverse civil society, and we believe that giving in its broadest forms, whether it's financial giving, non-financial giving, so volunteering, gifts in kind, taking to the streets, all of that is really important in strengthening and supporting civil society. And we do a number of things to try and achieve this vision, from working with donors, corporates, high net worth individuals, regular donors, to figure out how they can create the greatest impact, right through to with not-for-profits around how to strengthen resilience. And we have introduced a number of different giving solutions or vehicles, so donor-advised funds, a bank for the charitable sector, social investment, online platforms, to try and facilitate the flow of funds to the sector. And as part of that, we also do a lot of research that's publicly available, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. What's important for me to highlight is that we have a global alliance network of local partners working across 10 countries. So Brazil, India, South Africa, Russia, Turkey, UK, Australia, Canada, and US. You might be familiar with our partner, CAF America, and all of these partners come together behind this common vision. So given that we do a lot of research and given the unprecedented times we find ourselves in, the Global Alliance partners have increased the frequency of surveys to get a pulse on the sector, from weekly, bi-weekly, and monthly surveys to capture the impact of the crisis on the sector, the challenges and opportunities that it's presenting, and how the needs are evolving as the crisis evolves. In some cases, we are seeing the second wave emerge. Now, there's a lot to share, so I'm going to be very, very focused on insights from some of the polling, and I've divided it into 3 blocks around survive, adapt, and thrive. All of this is available publicly, so you can of course dig deeper should you need to. So on the next slide, you'll see, and this has been discussed a lot by Jacob, Naomi, and Serena, is the fact that demand for civil society services remains high, and there's an unprecedented squeeze at the same time on the civil society sector to respond, and survival is at risk. I think in the next slide, what I'd like to highlight here is that the effects of the virus are being felt by everyone, but it's being felt even more harshly in countries that have limited infrastructure, whether it's social, health, economic, to respond. So you can see that actually in these surveys in Brazil, India, and South Africa, it showed that more than half of civil society organizations would be unable to last more than 6 months without additional support, which is even bleaker than the situation in Australia and UK right here. So I think the case is that how do we continue to support the sector, and how is the sector adapting? So in the next slide, we asked charities, how have they adapted and adjusted to the current crisis? And focusing on these few countries, we've just pulled together what they had in common amongst their top 5. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of them. So working differently, and I think everyone's experienced this, working remotely. So the current crisis has pushed everyone to embrace technology. For some, it could be beneficial as it might have accelerated some necessary transformation. I have seen that happen at my own organization. However, in other cases, organizations have struggled to do so because of lack of resourcing, because of infrastructure, because of skills. Now, there's some funders who have introduced organizational support so charities can shift operations online. However, it raises questions around the extent to which charities have the resources available to invest in such infrastructure in the first place, and the extent to which they have the ability to prioritize this. And I think this ties in with the question around unrestricted funding and having greater control over your own programs. There's emphasis around continued mission and really staying true to the needs of your beneficiaries, given the impacts of the pandemic. I think there's some really hard decisions that charities have had to make. Some have been able to repurpose their activities because it makes sense, but some have had to look at what services can continue and what has to stop. And there is a really important role for leadership and trustees to play in this entire discussion. What we also found is that charities are finding new sources of funding, or they've started emergency fundraising. Now, in Giving Thought podcast, for those of you who might be interested, we talk a bit about how the crisis feels different on the giving side. The fact that it's universal in nature, so everyone is impacted, but the extent of impact is vastly different, and it's highlighting inequalities that have existed for decades. So the fundraising ask is different in the fact that it's not supporting them, but the ask is how do we support each other and how do we support us? Naomi mentioned cancellation of fundraising events, which has also had a huge impact. And so what we're seeing during this crisis is exploration and utilization of digital technologies to raise money. Now, these can be a bit versatile, less expensive, such as employee giving, payroll giving programs, online giving platforms, SMS giving, that can open different ways that charities can raise funds. We've seen local organizations, and I'm going to call them infrastructure organizations. I would describe them as a support network or system for charities and philanthropy, and they do a number of different things. And in this case, what I'd highlight is that some of these organizations have launched emergency response efforts to try and unlock more giving into the sector. So some examples from across the board is our partner Aegis in Brazil, working with some high net worth individuals and peers. They raised close to $8 million from 10,000 donors for hospitals, which was the local need in that context. And donations were as small as 25 USD. In Bulgaria, our partner Because, they raised €1 million through their online platform, and they were supported by 1,500 individual donors and about 7 companies. So we're seeing a lot of this collaboration happening at the local or national level, and we're also seeing it happen on the fundraising side at a global level. So take the case of Giving Tuesday, which was celebrated on 5th May 2020, and there was a call to action. There was about $503 million raised in online donations, and there were some great stories of inspiration and collaboration. One that I'm going to pull out is the Whitefish Community Foundation and Flathead Community Foundation. I hope I've got the names right. Came together in a first-time collaboration to support local organizations in Northwest Montana. 1,300 donors helped raise approximately $500,000 for about 78 different not-for-profit organizations. And I think, again, if you look at the results, this theme of collaboration, coordination, cooperation is really important, and it came so in our findings as well. And it starts from sharing of knowledge, best practice, learning, and maybe even simply signposting things like working from home, discussing what technology is available, what does the future of work look like, how can you collaborate on outreach to beneficiaries. This sense of connectedness, and I have seen this firsthand with our Global Alliance partners, it is pushing us to think outside of the box, to be inspired and to develop new initiatives to respond. On the next slide, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the charities, when we asked, well, what sort of support have you seen? They've highlighted new forms of support, which includes a lot of non-financial giving, such as gifts in kind, food, clothing, volunteering, in parallel with financial giving. The question with non-financial giving is, how are organizations set up to make the most of this? And how do you ensure that these gifts in kind are actually what you need? Otherwise, they can become quite burdensome. So communicating impact and work really becomes important, so the community understands what it is that you need. I think the impact on giving will need to be researched as the crisis and its consequences evolve. And Naomi mentioned that they'll be taking some research. We'll be undertaking research to understand this in some of our partner countries. How much will people give? What will motivate them to give more? Will some give more than others, given the disparity? All questions to be answered and to keep a pulse on. I think as support is unlocked, there is the question of access. In a survey by Civicus, they found that only 4% of organizations benefited from additional funding or improved support. So I think the other thing we need to be keeping an eye out on is, as more funding comes in, who actually has access to this and how do you make it more inclusive? On the next slide, the question, and I think that this is we poll charities on what are some of their top needs from governments. And I think the key thing I'd like to highlight here is that charities are seeking help so they can help themselves. So even if you look at unconditional cash grants or unrestricted funding, this is so that organizations can have greater control over their own programs, so they have the ability to pivot based on how the external environment is shifting or to the needs of their beneficiaries, and that is really important. What came out strongly as well is the need for policies that unlock individual and corporate giving. And I think this is where we start to look to the future. So much is fundamentally changing and we're at a tipping point of sorts. How do we ensure that we can effectively respond now, but also rebuild in a manner so we're better prepared and actually do things differently? So we're currently, in addition to our research, we're currently undertaking a global mapping exercise to map out good and bad policy practices that help unlock support for civil society and philanthropy across countries. The idea is that we have a bit of an evidence base to learn from best practices, and so that we can make recommendations that might actually shift things for the future. And some of the things that we're learning through this process is stimulus packages. There are countries that have introduced stimulus packages for the sector, which is good. However, that's only come about because of a lot of hardcore advocacy on behalf of the sector. And even where this has been introduced, there is a gap between what the sector needs and how much was provided. So there seems to be certain themes around civil society really being an afterthought rather than being seen as a strategic partner, as well as a misunderstanding of the fundraising ecosystem. So I think these are big questions that we need to be tackling as we move forward, and the learning that we're gathering from this exercise can be utilized to make a case for hopefully creating some more positive shifts as we move on. I believe I'm going to stop here and then hand it back to Serena.
Great, thank you, Samira. That was incredibly insightful. I think a lot of the response to COVID-19 has shed a lot of light on the cracks in the system, and as you said, the inequalities that have existed for so long. It's so important to recognize that this is a global issue and what the implications are of, the closing space in society, as you were alluding to. And really grateful for all the work of CAF and look forward to the global mapping of policies when it comes out. So with that, we've set the landscape of what's happening through survey responses, seen data on the survivability of the sector. And it's amazing that we have all this combined data and knowledge. And I really think what the sector is seeing generally, just more collaboration and conversation and the idea of figuring things out together. So in that spirit, and I'm glad Jacob, Naomi, and Samira, everyone turned their cameras back on, I'd like to move us into more of an open discussion with the panelists and invite an opportunity to respond to each other's presentations, as well as answer a few questions that were submitted at registration and that just came up for us. So Jacob, Naomi, Samira, feel free to speak freely, but maybe I'll kick us off with a question that came through about how should organizations help each other persist to weather the long-term effects of COVID-19? And what advice would you give to fundraising professionals worried about keeping realistic goals given this pandemic? So I'll give this one to Jacob first to respond, and then we can just see where things go.
Thank you, Serena, and thank you, Samira and Naomi. The novelist Arundhati Roy has described this crisis as a portal, and we get to choose what we bring with us as we pass through the portal. And I think that is true for the entire nonprofit sector. We have an opportunity here to reimagine things that weren't working well before. And that might have been true at the organizational level, a particular program that was struggling or a fundraising strategy that wasn't working. But I also think it's true at the field level in terms of the practices that we engage in and the power dynamics that so often pollute relationships in the nonprofit community. So I just hope that we take this opportunity to think big when it comes to, and maybe we can talk later about ways that could play out in structural and programmatic innovation. In terms of fundraising, I will just mention two things for nonprofits. The first is honesty and the second is innovation. And that now is a time to finally have the really honest conversations with funders about the actual nature of nonprofit business models. And usually going to funders with a sense of desperation is not a good strategy. But when you have an entire society feeling on edge, I think it just creates an opportunity for a kind of honesty that we don't see enough in the field. So let's really tell the truth about our business models and how things really work and what it really costs to create good. And then the second thing is innovation, that if we can take this moment as an opportunity to create new ways of doing things, new organizational structures, then that's the kind of thing that gets funders excited. I think if nonprofits go to funders and say, look, we are taking this moment to reimagine how we're structured, how we're governed, that's the kind of pitch that I think can open wallets. And we have seen that. We've seen extraordinary generosity around COVID in particular. And I think now is the chance for the field to say this is also an opportunity for us to reimagine the way we do our work.
I'll chime in here too. This moment feels so existential, right? A global health pandemic, a corresponding economic downturn, reckoning with our country's history of racial injustice, all on top of course, real threats to our democracy and climate change. And also, I don't want to go back to the old normal. And so I think, echoing what Jacob was saying, this is a real opportunity for transformation, for not rebuilding, but reimagining. And so, more specifically to advice for foundation professionals, fundraising professionals, and also other nonprofit leaders, I think, as I think about one of the most important things that you can do right now, and I know that there's a lot of power dynamics at play, right? The relationship between nonprofits and funders is inherently asymmetrical, and it can be really hard. We see this in our data. It can be really hard for nonprofits to tell their funders what they really need. So in this particular moment, though, I don't think is any good reason for funders to not give nonprofits the flexibility that they need to meet this moment. So if you feel like you're being constrained by grant restrictions, I encourage you to think about purpose and mission first, and ask your funders to release you from some of these restrictions. And if you are like some of the nonprofits that we surveyed that haven't heard from your funders about their future funding plans, I encourage you to reach out to them and ask. I know it's easy for me to say that. Again, there's real power dynamics at play, but my take is it's a whole lot riskier to not ask than to go ahead and reach out to your funders and have these honest, truthful conversations.
I think I'd agree with all of that. I think in terms of what we're seeing, I think networks are important right now. And the more I think people are open to collaborations in a very different way. I think institutional egos have gone to the side to an extent. Whether they stay there, we'll see. But I think we've seen some really strong examples of collaboration come out in terms of raising funds if you're working in the same community area. So how do you do more of that? And I think it's also for fundraising professionals, what do you mean by diverse funding models? I think really looking at the types of funding that are available, but the diversity of those funding streams also matters. So you could be dependent 90% on grants. However, if it's made up of 10 funders, none of whom represent more than 15% of your total income, that might give you a little bit more sustainability, less riskier, versus having a mixed portfolio of grants, contracts, loans that represents 33% each. So I think really looking at what fundraising models or funding models are out there that could really add value to your business model, and therefore feeding that into your fundraising strategy could be really useful.
Thank you all. That was like such a great response, and I agree with you all. And I'm still thinking about how organizations can break out of this dependency model that's existed for so long, and what the really acknowledging that it's not sustainable, and that much of COVID-19 seems to be a symptom of sustainability issues. And so, thinking about some of what Samira mentioned too, about how organizations have adapted their funding, and what Naomi's mentioned about the power differences. I'm wondering, do you anticipate, funding for sustainability and long-term solutions to increase? Do we, sort of trust that there will be a shift in funder practice that sticks for a longer term? And I think, maybe a lot of that thinking has also shifted in society, just realizing that like COVID wasn't just a few months, and we don't really know how long this is going to last. But I'm wondering if there's any projections or anticipations for funder practice that we are seeing right now to really like sustain itself. And I'll let anyone who feels like responding get back to that one.
I'm happy to take a first stab at it, and I want to hear what Samira and Jacob have to say too. I think, right, Serena, this is a huge question. It's a really important question. It's also, right, not a new question. Conversations and calls from nonprofit leaders for flexible long-term funding are, that's not a new conversation in the sector. And I think there's a real opportunity for this moment to shift that conversation. In fact, we at CEP are in the process of analyzing some data that has just come in for a broader study that we're doing about foundations' response to these compounded crises. I think, I just want to underscore the point Jacob made earlier that even pre-pandemic, many nonprofits were in, dire financial straits. Look at the number of months for which they have operating cash on hand. And so let me just share some, I'm going to share some data, but first I want to say, I think in this particular moment, CEP, with a number of other philanthropy serving organizations, have advocated for funders to increase their giving, right? I just want to make the point that what nonprofits need right now is more money. And without a meaningful infusion of these resources, many of them will dramatically pare back programs and services or will be forced to close their doors. And the results of that on the economy, on marginalized communities, on progress that we've made on crucial issues is going to be devastating, all at a time, right, when so many nonprofits are standing between marginalized people and a government that's actively targeting them. And so I say that to emphasize the importance of this conversation. We are, though, in the data that we've got, and here's the sneak peek, we're seeing some positive trends. First, broadly, more flexibility and loosening of restrictions. We're also seeing in the data that we've collected from a couple hundred foundation CEOs across the US that more than 70% of funders say that they have or will increase their foundation's grant-making budget in the current fiscal year from what was previously budgeted. We're also seeing that 75% of foundations say that now, compared to their pre-pandemic levels, are providing more unrestricted support. Interestingly, a good number say that they plan to continue this post-pandemic. And I think also I want to add here too, with regard to issues of racial justice and racial equity, foundations are telling us that they are making new efforts to support organizations serving communities of color, and more importantly, new efforts to support organizations led by people of color, particularly CEOs from Black communities. So of course, right, only time will tell. We're doing a longitudinal study to understand the extent to which these practices really stick over time. But I think some of these data points give me hope and a sense that this moment can be more of a transformation.
Thank you, Naomi. Those are really, hopeful points, and I'm really hoping that there is a real shift that we see moving forward that sticks long term. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Serena. I was just going to add, in terms of things sticking long term, I think it will have, if anything, there needs to be a recognition of the importance of foresight for civil society, and it's underfunded. The pandemic has demonstrated this. So if you're looking at aspects of resilience, and what I mean by resilience is the ability of a charity to look ahead and keep abreast of what's going on, be able to pivot, be agile, be flexible, but still make sure that they can create impact on the ground. That has a number of different elements. So to what extent do we understand that? So there is financial sustainability, but there's also leadership. There is also making sure that your purpose is clear, governance issues. To what extent are funders going to help support the strengthening of those aspects? And either it's providing unrestricted income, because it does show power dynamics and it does reflect on trust issues. So to what extent do we trust our charity partners to be able to do what they do best? And I think this is a time where, given demand is high, hopefully that relationship or those questions can shift. In terms of things for the long term, there are countries that have been introducing tax incentives to unlock giving. So in some cases, it's just for the COVID response, but there is a potential maybe to learn from it and extend it because it's positive. In other countries, like in Russia, they've introduced tax incentives for corporates for the first time, which is fantastic. The only issue is that it's only for charities that are on the government register. So how do you sort of use that as an example to say, how do you make sure that it's available to diversity of organizations? And that's why I think advocacy on behalf of the sector becomes really, really important.
Thank you, Samira. Those are great points, and I know it's really it's clear that funding is needed, and funding is needed fast and flexibly, and it's not just about the funding, but everything that comes with the funder-grantee relationship and just how we proceed as a civil society on the whole. I'm just checking the time here and noticing that there's only a couple minutes left, and I know that there's a few housekeeping things to get to, but I just really wanted to thank all three of you for such a great conversation. And I know we've seen a lot of the data and insights here, and that there's so much great opportunity to work here toward greater sustainability with resilience and long-term direction in mind. Jacob, anything to add, or?
Sure, I'll just offer two kind of closing thoughts. One is, and I think Serena and I can speak to the fact that mergers are hard. But now is a time, I think, for nonprofits to be creative about structure. It doesn't have to mean a merger or an acquisition, but to reimagine organizational structure. Now's a good time for that. And then second is that the technology that we are blessed to have access to has opened up some really extraordinary possibilities for the nonprofit sector. And I also hope that we are been reminded of just how precious it is to have in-person connections, and that the nonprofit sector is a platform for so much in-person interaction. And once we're through the portal, how do we reimagine those interactions programmatically and then within our own organizations?
Thank you, Jacob. And with that, I'll say thank you to our panelists and pass it back on to Elizabeth.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I think we've definitely have learned a lot, but I think more than anything, we learned that there's so many more questions left to answer in terms of what lies ahead for organizations and what we can continue advocating for, and hopefully, as you all said, kind of reimagine how we move forward. Thank you so much to our entire panel. I am internally grateful for your time and effort and everything that you've shared with us here today. If you do want to reconnect or ask any further questions, definitely interact with them in the social media world. Here are everyone's various handles. Thank you so much, everyone. Be well, stay safe, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.